Good evening, wonderful viewer. I am the Marine Painter, and tonight we are going to talk about the creation of this painting. The final battle of the Dutch East Indiaman, the Wapen van Rotterdam, which you can see here on the left, as it is about to be attacked by 3 English warships during the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The final journey of the Wapen van Rotterdam is a fascinating story of bad luck and betrayal that is not as grand or glorious as the big battles that decided the war, but is still definitely worth exploring through painting. But before we delve into how the painting was made, we first need to understand why the ship found itself in such an unfortunate position. The Wapen van Rotterdam left the Dutch island of Texel on the 16th of December 1673 with 400 crew and soldiers on board. It was assigned to go halfway around the world to the Dutch colony at Batavia, present-day Jakarta, Indonesia, to reinforce the garrison there. Under normal circumstances it would simply pass through the English Channel and get on its way. However, since the Dutch Republic was at war with both the English and the French, the English Channel was a pretty dangerous place for a Dutch trading ship. The Wapen van Rotterdam therefore had no other option than to take the long way all around the island of Great Britain. But as it was sailing north, it was suddenly struck by a violent storm from the south. The wild seas ripped the ship's rudder clean off, while its mast was snipped like firewood by the high wind. And to make matters worse, the sudden wind would not let up, and the crippled ship continued to drift northward. Any return to the Netherlands was now out of the question, as it needed to find a safe refuge to wait out the winter storms and carry out repairs. The crew therefore decided to head to the Bay of Rotterdam in the Shetland Islands. From there they hoped to slip past the British and back to the Netherlands in spring. As the ship waited in Rotterdam, it continued to be harried by icy blizzards and strong winds, but it also found some respite in some sympathetic locals who were willing to trade with the stricken ship, which allowed the crew to carry out some repairs. However, not all residents were as amenable to the Dutch, and word soon reached London that there was a big Dutch ship, unable to escape and ripe for the taking, anchored in Rotterdam. The English had to hurry though. The wider war against the Dutch was going pretty terrible. After several failed invasion attempts, the English were almost out of money and entered into secret negotiations with the Dutch to abandon their French allies and restore peace. This meant that the clock was ticking. The Wapen van Rotterdam had to be seized before peace was signed, and so 3 ships were immediately dispatched: the HMS Newcastle, the HMS Crown, and the HMS Cambridge. The 3 ships finally reached the bay on the 14th of March 1674, a full 23 days after peace had been signed with the Dutch. As the ships entered the snowy bay, the Dutch, who were unaware that the war had already ended 3 weeks earlier, had nowhere left to run. And this is the moment I wanted to capture in the painting. After a harrowing and freezing journey, the moment the HMS Newcastle revealed itself to the Dutch, the crew finally knew that their luck had run out. Now, in order to turn this story into a painting, I first start with some thumbnail sketching to try out different compositions for telling the story and to decide at what moment of the battle I want to capture and from which vantage point. After deciding which thumbnail I like the most, I draw it again but on a larger scale to see if it really works, and once that drawing is finished, I turn it into a quick oil sketch. And the reason I chose this composition is that this to me seemed like the most emotionally resonant moment of the story. Rather than the battle being in full swing, everyone high on adrenaline, and the Dutch crew already fully aware that they are in the fight for their lives, I chose the moment that finally shattered any hope the Dutch crew had left. They had seen the 3 ships coming for a long time, but they had always been hidden behind the features of the terrain. But at this moment, as the HMS Newcastle revealed itself, they finally definitively knew that there would be no escape. Next up, it's time to look at the ships involved, beginning with our main character, the Wapen van Rotterdam. Sadly, there are no surviving pictures of the Wapen van Rotterdam, though we are still able to reconstruct how she may have looked during her final journey, partly thanks to descriptions of the ship in newspapers from the time. The article you see here, for instance, reveals that the ship carried 36 guns, 400 men, and displaced about 1,200 tons. But even more important is this rather sour-looking man, Willem van der Velde the Elder, and his slightly more jolly son, Willem van der Velde the Younger. These two artists were the most renowned maritime painters of the 17th century, and produced hundreds of paintings and thousands of drawings that we can use to reconstruct a ship. One final feature that distinguished the Wapen van Rotterdam from other ships is the large wood carving on the stern. Every Dutch ship had a unique wood carving that reflected its name, so in the case of the Wapen van Rotterdam, I used the coat of arms of the city of Rotterdam, while placing the two lions you see here on the top of the stern. Next it's time to draw the HMS Newcastle. Fortunately, Willem van der Velde the Younger had made two drawings of this ship, so I didn't have to design it from scratch. Nevertheless, I still decided to copy one of his drawings to make sure that I get a good grasp of all the details. In the end, this turned out to be unnecessary since the ship is pretty small in the final painting, but drawing these magnificent ships is a reward in itself, so I don't mind. Finally, we move to the painting panel. I use a must panel of 30 by 40 centimeters, and this is a really smooth kind of panel that is perfect for painting the sorts of details that I just love. But before we can start painting, I just have to sketch out the composition one final time before applying a layer of acrylic paint. I used this first base layer of acrylic paint to seal in the graphite of my pencil and to act as a foundation layer for the subsequent layers of oil paint. It always looks really ugly and it makes me very nervous, but it always turns out to be a crucial step. And once the acrylic layer is finished, I move on to the oil paint layer for the sky. From weather reports from the time, we know that the weather around Great Britain was awful throughout March 1674. The north of Scotland had been battered by icy blizzards for weeks, so I wanted to paint the sky in a way that properly reflected the threatening weather, while also adding to the general mood of coming doom. As the YouTube algorithm decided for some arcane reason that it was high time I watched some musical propaganda videos from the Soviet Union, I came across this still in a movie about the harvest from 1949, and I just think this sky is amazing. First of all, it turns the rather mundane activity of transporting grain into something way more spectacular, but more importantly, the cloud seems really eerie to me, an inescapable sign of approaching danger lumbering over the ill-fated ship. But while I wanted the clouds to be dark and threatening, the water in the bay should be nice and calm, providing the safe refuge that the ship so desperately needed, nothing more than a few ripples here and there. And now that the sky and the sea are finished, we can start painting the ship. I chose to make the ship quite dark because this was an old ship that had been weathered by several journeys to Batavia. However, I painted the rudder in a much lighter, slightly reddish brown, because as you may remember, the ship's rudder had been blown off during the storm in the North Sea, and I like to imagine that it had since been repaired. Ships like this carried plenty of carpenters and spare wood to make these kinds of repairs, though this wood would not have been nearly as weathered as the rest of the ship, which creates some nice contrast. And now it's time to really have some fun. It is time for the wood carvings on the stern of the ship. First I paint a general outline of the shapes, before starting to apply shadow color to create all kinds of little figures and decorations. I can also start adding other kinds of narrative elements that usually decorated the sterns of these ships, such as the coats of arms of neighboring cities, in this case Middelburg, Delft, Amsterdam, as well as Rotterdam of course, and I also painted a panorama of its namesake city, which often adorned the sterns of Dutch ships that were named after towns. Finally, I just add a few more highlights along the edge of the wood carvings to finish up the stern of the ship. Once the decorations are finished, I move on to painting the hull. First setting out a few lines to get an idea of the dimensions of the hull and the shape of the railings, because everything, and I mean everything, curves in these ships, so drawing out the dimensions in advance is critical to make sure that everything aligns properly. Once the shape of the hull is laid out properly, we turn to the details, the guns with their beautiful red hatches and the massive anchors. The moment we see here is the moment the ship's cannon have been readied for battle and the anchor is being hauled out of the water in preparation for the final confrontation. By the way, the silver pole in this shot is my broomstick, which I use to steady my hands. I try to keep it out of frame as much as possible, but my hands are really shaky, so sometimes it is just unavoidable. Once the hull is finished, we can move on to the sails. Just like with the hull, getting the shape right is everything, because sails can introduce a lot of movement to a painting. By adding shadows in just the right spots, you can create the illusion that the sails are being pushed against the mast by the relentless wind. And this is another reason why I like this composition the most. The ship faces south, against the wind and towards the light, and I chose this orientation to further emphasize the fact that the ship was basically immobile, and because the powerful southern wind was such a vital part of the story. Putting the ship against the wind seemed like a nice symbolic summary of the entire journey. After finishing the sails, I suddenly remembered that this ship had been suffering through blizzards for months now, so there should probably be some snow on the wood carvings and on the surface of the ship. And once all of that is finished, we can finally turn to the flags, which are another reason why painting sailing ships is so incredibly fun, because they add so much more movement and drama, and this flag is no exception. Together with the sails, it really demonstrates the intensity of the terrible southern winds that kept the ship prisoner. And here is the finished ship. As you can see, I've already painted the rigging for the Wapen van Rotterdam, and maybe someday I will figure out how to film this, but my present technique involves me almost touching the panel with my nose, as the details are just way too fine to paint from a distance. And this means that if I were to film this step, you would basically only see the back of my head. But before we call this painting finished, it is time to move towards our distant menace, the English ships. I do not want to detail the English ships too much. They are not the focus of the painting, though I did want to make sure that the HMS Newcastle that is passing the peninsula is clearly a British warship. And after finishing the last few flags on the British squadron, we are finally done. And here we have the final result, from a pencil sketch to an oil sketch to finally a finished painting. In the end, the Wapen van Rotterdam did not stand a chance against three more powerful and mobile opponents. It is unknown how many Dutch crew members died in the battle, though one of the English ships, the HMS Crown, carried off 100 prisoners, which were subsequently repatriated to the Dutch Republic, as the war had already ended. Today there's still a monument in the bay in the Shetland Islands commemorating the Dutch sailors that died that day. The Wapen van Rotterdam would continue to serve in the Royal Navy as an unarmed hulk named the HMS Arms of Rotterdam until she was broken up in 1703. The goods the ship carried would be auctioned off on the 24th of May 1674, and the letters she carried are actually still in the Admiralty's archive in London and have partly been published since 2014. The Third Anglo-Dutch War of 1672 to 1674 was marked by several massive fleet engagements involving hundreds of French, English and Dutch warships, as the English attempted to invade the Netherlands from the sea, while the French invaded the country over land. However, on the margins of these huge naval battles, countless smaller tragedies befell the crews of Dutch, English and French merchant ships all over the world, as the warring parties fought over loot, prizes and to shut down each other's trade. With this painting, I wanted to explore these tragedies by focusing on one specific event, as the experience of the crew of the Wapen van Rotterdam was shared by the crews of many more ships around the world. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who has made it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the story and the painting. Goodbye for now, and I will see you all soon with the next painting, which will be of a far more widely known event.